I'm gonna say this and say no offense, but I'm gonna offend some people anyway. So whatever. White people in the Northeast look real Irish, like real Italian.
You're not crazy. You've actually just discovered very basic, like, human geography migration patterns. Because you're right, why does it seem like there's so many Irish and Italian Americans on the East Coast? It's because statistically, the East Coast has the most Irish and Italian ancestry. It's just like how the Midwest and Minnesota specifically has a lot of German, Swedish, and also Norwegian ancestry, which I am actually all of those things. California, Arizona, and Texas has the most Mexican and Mexican American ancestry. And again, statistically, a lot of African American or the Afro American population resides in the southern part of the country. You might ask yourself, well, why those specific parts? Well, there's always an answer if you go looking for it. Boston has like the largest Irish population. Way back in the early days, Irish people were brought over and then they had to work as indentured servants, as they referred to it, until they could earn their freedom to pay for their passage, essentially. And then in later waves, around the time of the potato famine, if we're familiar with that, a lot of them came over to the United States because they already had family here, especially in Boston. They were probably like, hey, there's maybe opportunity over here. And you're totally right. They probably came in around like the Ellis Island area, so they didn't have a lot of money to travel anywhere. And most of their family and relatives and friends probably already resided in Boston, so they just said, we'll head up to where the people we know already are. It's similar to the wave of Germans and Norwegians and Swedish that got word of the Homestead Act that was happening in the Midwest, specifically around Minnesota and those states, which incentivized them to come and build farms over there. Which then again, with further movements, of course, families came over to those areas because they already had relatives and friends that lived there. And another movement I found particularly interesting to learn about is that Minnesota is actually home to the largest number of Somali Americans in the entire country. And a lot of people are always confused by that or surprised when they hear that statistic because, yes, Minnesota is kind of like a random state that's freezing cold up in the north. Like, what attracts anyone to this unless your family's already here? Well, I believe it was in the late 80s or early 90s, there was a civil war that happened in Somalia. And so a lot of Somali people wanted to go seek refuge and leave the country. And the Minnesota government set up some incentives and things that made our state more enticing. We also had like a lot of volunteer placement programs that helped relocate them to Minnesota. So yeah, if you ever start noticing patterns that seem like very distinct and out of the blue, like there's just a bunch of random German people in these few states in the middle of nowhere, USA, if you do some quick digging, you'll probably find the answer, and it usually has something to do with the government.